September 1943, the rolling farmland of southeastern England stretched quiet and unremarkable beneath an overcast afternoon sky. A Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft, a Junkers Ju-88, fitted with high-resolution cameras, banked low over the patchwork countryside at roughly 25,000 feet, its cameras clicking with mechanical precision every 3 seconds. The pilot, a veteran of dozens of such missions, had been ordered to confirm what German intelligence had already half suspected, that the Allies were massing a tremendous armoured force somewhere in the south of England, a build-up so enormous that its shadow, if not its substance, had already reached the desks of Wehrmacht planners in Berlin. What the cameras captured that afternoon confirmed everything. Column after column of Sherman tanks, parked in neat military rows stretching across open fields, fuel depots, artillery parks, dozens of landing craft lined up along riverbanks, supply dumps of staggering scale. The photographic interpreters in Berlin processed the imagery with the calm professionalism of men who believed they were reading the truth. They marked coordinates. They updated their operational maps. They dispatched urgent cables to Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. And they were wrong. Catastrophically, completely, and fatally wrong. There were no tanks in those fields. Not a single real one. No fuel, no artillery, no army. What the German cameras had captured, what had fooled the finest photographic intelligence apparatus in the world, was rubber. Rubber and canvas, inflated with air compressors, arranged by a small team of artists, engineers, advertising men, and one visionary officer who had understood something about the nature of modern war that most generals had not yet grasped. That in the 20th century, the most powerful weapon a nation could field was not firepower, it was perception. What followed was one of the most extraordinary deception operations in the history of warfare. The men who executed it were fewer than 1,100 strong. They carried no heavy weapons. They wore no medals of distinction. They had been recruited not from the ranks of infantry battalions or armored divisions, but from art schools, Broadway costume departments, Hollywood sound studios, and the offices of Madison Avenue advertising agencies. They called themselves, with a certain theatrical pride, the Ghost Army, and in the space of less than 2 years, they would reshape the course of the war in Europe. This is their story, and it begins, as all great deceptions do, with a single man who understood something the enemy did not, the mathematics of illusion, what the numbers reveal. The 23rd Headquarters, Special Troops, the Ghost Army's official designation, conducted 21 distinct deception operations between September 1943 and the final weeks of the war in Europe in April 1945. Against a force of roughly 1,100 men, they simulated entire divisions. On paper, on German paper, they conjured the equivalent of 2 full army corps, complete with armored components, infantry support, artillery, logistics trains, and command headquarters. The men they impersonated numbered, at peak calculation, over 30,000 soldiers who did not exist. The implications are staggering when rendered in the only language that war ultimately understands. German commanders diverted whole panzer divisions, shifted entire defensive lines, repositioned artillery concentrations, and delayed critical counterattacks, all in response to forces that existed only in canvas, compressed air, amplified sound recordings, and brilliantly forged radio traffic. Historians who have studied the operations in detail estimate that the Ghost Army's deceptions saved tens of thousands of American lives. Some put the figure significantly higher. The true accounting may never be fully rendered, but the arithmetic of what did not happen, the counterattacks that were held back, the flanks that were never hit, the crossings that were allowed to proceed, speaks in unmistakable terms. In the final crossing of the Rhine in March 1945, the Ghost Army's last and perhaps most audacious operation, they simulated an entire army corps preparing to cross at a false point, drawing the German defenders' attention away from the actual crossing site. The real operation proceeded with dramatically reduced resistance. Estimates suggest the deception saved the lives of between 10 and 30,000 soldiers in that single operation alone. These numbers were not the product of genius operating in isolation. They were the result of a system, a philosophy, a doctrine, and an astonishing collection of human talent assembled at exactly the right moment in history by men who understood that war, at its most sophisticated level, is not merely a physical contest. It is a contest of minds, and in that contest the Ghost Army had no equal. The world that made them, before the Ghost Army existed. To understand what the Ghost Army accomplished, one must first understand the world into which they were born, the military world of 1942, in which deception as a formal doctrine of war was barely acknowledged and only partially understood. The United States Army that entered the Second World War was in many respects a 19th-century institution, being thrust into the 20th century at speed. Its doctrine prized mass, firepower, and logistical depth. Its generals measured strength in divisions and tonnage. Its culture rewarded the orthodox and viewed the unconventional with deep institutional suspicion. In that world, a proposal to waste 1,100 men and considerable resources on what amounted, from the outside, to an elaborate theatrical performance would have been met with derision. Fighting men carried rifles. Fighting men drove tanks. Fighting men died in the line. The notion that a group of painters, sound engineers, and advertising copywriters could contribute meaningfully to the defeat of Nazi Germany struck most senior officers as, at best, eccentric, and at worst, a criminal misallocation of manpower at a time when every warm body was needed at the front. And yet the war itself was teaching lessons that doctrine had not anticipated. The German blitzkrieg of 1939 and 1940 had demonstrated that speed and surprise, the disruption of the enemy's decision-making cycle, could achieve results that brute force alone could not. The British had begun to study deception seriously in the Western Desert, where Brigadier Dudley Clark's A-Force had pioneered the use of dummy tanks and false radio traffic against Rommel with considerable success. Operation Bertram, the deception that preceded El Alamein in October 1942, had concealed an entire armored corps from German observation for weeks, contributing materially to Montgomery's victory. The lessons existed. What was needed was a man willing to learn them, to systematize them, and to convince a skeptical army to let him try. That man's name was Ralph Ingersoll, and alongside him, in the particular crucible of the early planning stages, was a figure whose name has only recently begun to receive the recognition it deserves, Lieutenant Colonel Hilton Howell Rayleigh, a public relations man and adventurer who had once managed Amelia Earhart's publicity and who understood, with a showman's instinctive clarity, that the audience for the Ghost Army's performances was not the American public, it was the German High Command. And Germans, like all audiences, could be manipulated if you understood their expectations. The instruments of illusion, a technical inventory. The Ghost Army operated with 4 primary weapons, each representing a distinct discipline, each requiring its own specialists, each capable of independent operation, but most lethal when combined. Understanding these weapons in technical detail is essential to understanding what they actually achieved. This was not intuitive genius at work. This was engineering. The first weapon was visual deception. The 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion, which formed the artistic spine of the Ghost Army, operated an inventory of inflatable decoys that was, by any measure, extraordinary. At full deployment, the battalion could field more than 200 inflatable M4 Sherman tanks, each one constructed from a specially developed rubber compound that, when inflated, reproduced the profile, shadow, and silhouette of an actual 32-ton tank with remarkable fidelity. A single inflatable Sherman weighed 93 pounds and could be carried by 2 men. It could be inflated to operational dimensions, roughly 30 feet in length and 8 feet in height, in approximately 15 minutes using standard air compressors. It could then be positioned, angled, camouflaged, and abandoned. And when viewed from the altitude at which German reconnaissance aircraft operated, it was, within the limits of 1940s aerial photography, indistinguishable from the real thing. But the Shermans were only the beginning. The visual inventory included inflatable artillery pieces, 105 mm and 155 mm howitzers, reproduced in rubber and canvas with their characteristic barrel profiles, inflatable half-tracks, dummy jeeps, false ammunition dumps constructed from empty crates covered with appropriate camouflage netting, landing craft mock-ups built from wood and canvas and floated on rivers to simulate assault force concentrations, dummy airfields, complete with false aircraft constructed of painted plywood and aluminum, intended to draw Luftwaffe bombing missions away from real installations. The scale of what could be assembled was breathtaking. In a single night, a force of 1,100 men could simulate the physical presence of a division of 15,000. The second weapon was sonic deception. The 3,132 Signal Service Company Special operated what was, in its time, one of the most sophisticated mobile audio systems in the world. Sound engineers at Bell Laboratories in New Jersey had spent months recording the actual acoustic signatures of armored movements, the specific grinding of tank treads against gravel roads, the particular pitch of diesel engines under load, the clanking of vehicle columns moving at night, the distant rumble of artillery being repositioned. These recordings were compiled onto acetate discs and fed through a system of powerful speakers, some rated at up to 500 watts, extraordinary for the period, mounted on armored half-tracks that could be driven to positions near the front. The range at which these sounds could be heard was carefully calculated. Under appropriate atmospheric conditions, the sonic deception equipment could project convincing armored movement sounds for a radius of 15 miles. 15 miles. The German soldier, crouching in his foxhole, hearing the unmistakable sound of tank columns moving in the darkness beyond his line of sight, had no technological means available to him to distinguish those sounds from the real thing. His ears told him that armor was coming. His commanders, receiving his reports, adjusted their dispositions accordingly, and the armor that was coming remained, for the moment, elsewhere. The third weapon was radio deception. The signal company of the Ghost Army was perhaps its most technically demanding component. The art of radio deception, what military planners called spoof radio, required not merely the transmission of false information, but the simulation of an entire division's radio network with such fidelity that German signals intelligence, monitoring Allied frequencies with sophisticated equipment and trained analysts, would find nothing anomalous, nothing that would suggest the traffic was fabricated. This was extraordinarily difficult. Every radio operator has what the Army called a fist, an individual signature in the rhythm and timing of their Morse transmissions as distinctive as a fingerprint. When the Ghost Army simulated a division, they had to replicate the fists of that division's actual radio operators precisely, because German signals analysts were trained to detect substitutions. They had to transmit at the correct frequencies, with the correct encryption protocols, at the correct traffic volumes, and in the correct operational patterns. A real division conducting a river crossing generated a specific and recognizable pattern of radio traffic, increased volume, specific message types, predictable sequences. Any deviation from that pattern would alert a competent analyst that something was wrong. The Ghost Army's radio operators became, in effect, impersonators of the highest order. They studied the target division's actual radio operators. They practiced their fists. They memorized the division's communication protocols and operational rhythms. And when the time came to simulate that division at a false location, they produced radio traffic so convincing that German signals intelligence, some of the best in the world, accepted it without significant skepticism. The fourth weapon was the most human of all, personal deception. The Ghost Army deployed soldiers into bars, cafes, and civilian spaces near the front, where they engaged in deliberately indiscreet conversation. They left false unit markings visible in public spaces. They placed fictional insignia on vehicles. They spoke loudly about units and movements that did not exist, knowing that German intelligence had informants in civilian populations, and that careless Allied soldiers were routinely debriefed by enemy agents. This was theatre at its most intimate, performed not on a stage but in a French bistro, with the audience sitting across the room and the stakes being not applause, but lives. Operation Elephant, the first performance, the Ghost Army's first real operational deployment, came in the late summer of 1944, in the chaos and confusion of the Allied breakout from Normandy. The unit had trained in Britain, rehearsed its techniques, argued about its doctrine, and suffered through the inevitable bureaucratic friction of an organization that nobody in the conventional army quite knew what to do with. Now, in France, they were being asked to perform. The audience was real. The stakes were absolute. The operation, informally known among the men as Elephant, required the Ghost Army to simulate the presence of the 6th Armored Division at a location in the Brittany Peninsula. Drawing German attention and potentially pinning German forces, that might otherwise have been redeployed to resist the main Allied thrust toward Paris. The 6th Armored was real, but it was moving. The Ghost Army was to become its shadow, to convince German observers that the division remained where it had been, while the actual formation slipped away to its new objective. Sergeant Bob Tompkins, a former commercial artist from Philadelphia, who had been painting department store window displays before the war, later recalled the particular unreality of those first nights. "You'd be out in a field at 2 a.m, pumping air into a rubber tank," he said, "and you'd think, this is the craziest thing that has ever happened to any human being. And then you'd hear the guns, somewhere not very far away, and you'd remember that this crazy thing you were doing actually mattered." The setup took 4 nights. The inflatable Shermans were positioned along ridgelines and in open fields, where German aerial observation would almost certainly pick them up. The sonic equipment was moved into positions along a secondary road network, where it broadcast the sounds of column movement during hours when German intelligence expected such activity. The radio operators, impersonating the 6th Armored's actual signals personnel with painstaking accuracy, transmitted traffic volumes and message patterns consistent with an armored division in a static defensive posture. German reconnaissance aircraft photographed the positions on the 2nd and 3rd days. The imagery went to Berlin, and in Berlin the analysts updated their maps. The 6th Armored, their maps told them, was in Brittany. That intelligence influenced German dispositions. It influenced where reinforcements were sent and where they were held back. It shaped, in ways that can only be partially reconstructed from post-war records, the decisions made by German commanders in the critical weeks of the breakout. The first performance had worked, and the Ghost Army had learned something of inestimable value. The German intelligence apparatus, for all its sophistication, had a fundamental vulnerability. It believed what it saw, and what it saw could be manufactured. The architecture of belief, how deception is built. The success of the early operations prompted a systematic refinement of Ghost Army doctrine that reveals, in microcosm, the difference between improvised trickery and genuine strategic deception. Improvised trickery produces 1 or 2 convincing moments. Strategic deception builds an architecture of consistent, cross-corroborating evidence that makes the false reality not merely plausible, but for the deceived, the only rational interpretation of everything they observe. The Ghost Army, by late 1944, had begun to master the construction of that architecture. The key insight, developed through operational experience and refined by men like Captain Frederick Fox, a former Navy intelligence officer attached to the unit as a deception planner, was that German intelligence operated like all intelligence systems. It cross-referenced a single piece of evidence, a radio transmission, a photographic sighting, a report from an informant, was rarely accepted at face value. It was checked against other indicators. What the Ghost Army had to do was not merely produce one convincing piece of evidence, but to flood multiple intelligence channels simultaneously with mutually reinforcing false data. This required a level of coordination that was genuinely formidable for an organization of its size. When simulating a division, the Ghost Army had to ensure that visual indicators confirmed sonic indicators, that radio traffic confirmed visual sightings, that human intelligence from informants in local populations confirmed what the aerial cameras had photographed. The timing had to be precise. If the radio traffic suggested a division was moving east, but the inflatable tanks remained stationary in their original positions, a careful German analyst might notice the discrepancy. The Ghost Army could not afford carelessness. Captain Fox developed what he called the continuity principle, the requirement that every element of a deception operation maintain internal logical consistency across time. A division moving from point A to point B would generate specific, predictable indicators in sequence. The right amount of radio traffic during movement, visual evidence of transit, vehicles on roads, dust signatures, vehicle tracks in soft ground. Then the appropriate indicators of arrival and settling in at point B. Reduced movement traffic, increased administrative traffic, the sounds of a formation going into bivouac. The Ghost Army had to simulate not a photograph but a motion picture, not a moment but a process. And that process had to unfold according to the same logic that governed real military operations. The men who executed these operations were, in many cases, thinking about them in artistic terms. And this was not a metaphor. The 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion contained in its ranks men who would go on to become some of the most celebrated figures in post-war American art and design. Bill Blass, who would become one of the preeminent names in American fashion. Ellsworth Kelly, whose abstract paintings would hang in the world's great museums. Art Kane, whose photographs would define a generation of visual culture. These men were not in the Ghost Army despite their artistic sensibilities. They were there because of them. The ability to see from the enemy's perspective, to understand what a German photographic interpreter would see, to understand what would convince him, and what would trigger suspicion, required exactly the kind of visual intelligence that artistic training develops. Ellsworth Kelly, then a young private first class assigned to camouflage design, later recalled that the work of deception had taught him something fundamental about the nature of representation. You had to think constantly about what the thing looked like from a specific angle, from a specific altitude, in a specific light, he said. It was about controlling perception. And that is, in the end, what all visual art is about. Kelly would spend the rest of his life exploring the relationship between form and perception. The Ghost Army had been his first laboratory. The campaigns, operation by operation into dominance. By the autumn of 1944, the Ghost Army was no longer a theoretical proposition. It was a proven operational capability, and its tempo of operations was accelerating to match the accelerating pace of the campaign in Western Europe. What had begun as tentative, carefully hedged experiments in visual and electronic deception had evolved into a sophisticated operational rhythm, with the unit moving rapidly from one theatre to another, executing operations in sequence, sometimes overlapping, sometimes separated by only days, always pushing against the boundaries of what was technically and humanly possible. Operation Brest, conducted in September 1944, around the besieged port city of Brest in northwestern France, required the Ghost Army to simulate the presence of armored forces at points around the German defensive perimeter that were, in reality, held only by light infantry. The German garrison of some 38,000 men under General Hermann Bernhard Ramke was known to be considering breakout attempts, probing Allied lines for weaknesses. The Ghost Army's task was to ensure that the sectors Ramke's planners identified as potential breakout points appeared to be held in far greater strength than they actually were. The inflatable Shermans were positioned in hull-down positions along ridgelines overlooking the sectors in question. The sonic equipment broadcast the sounds of tank engines and track movements through the night. German artillery, responding to what it believed were concentrations of Allied armor, expended ammunition against positions that held nothing but rubber and air. The Germans did not break out. Whether the deception was the decisive factor in that decision, or merely one of many, cannot be stated with certainty. But the mathematics are suggestive. Ramke's forces outnumbered the actual Allied troops facing them in the deception sectors by a substantial margin. He had the men, the motivation, and the tactical situation to justify an aggressive breakout attempt. He did not make one. 38,000 soldiers surrendered to a force they could, under realistic assessment, have broken through. The Ghost Army's rubber tanks may have been among the reasons why. In October and November of 1944, as the Allied advance began to slow against the fortified positions of the Siegfried Line, and as the harsh European autumn turned the ground to mud and reduced aerial reconnaissance opportunities on both sides, the Ghost Army adapted its techniques for the changed operational environment. Reduced flying weather meant fewer opportunities for German aerial photography, which diminished the relative importance of the visual component. It correspondingly elevated the importance of signals deception and sonic operations, disciplines that were unaffected by cloud cover and that could, in some respects, operate more effectively at night when German ground observation was limited. The radio operators, young men who had been recruited in many cases directly from civilian radio amateur communities, the so-called ham radio operators, who had spent their adolescences building crystal radio sets in suburban basements, rose to unprecedented levels of technical virtuosity. They had, by this point, accumulated months of operational experience impersonating specific divisions, specific radio operators, specific command networks. They knew their target's communication habits with an intimacy that bordered on the uncanny. They knew when a particular operator took his meal break, They knew the subtle variations in fist that emerged when an operator was tired versus rested. They reproduced those variations faithfully. The effect on German signals intelligence was precisely what had been intended. The Funkabwehr, German radio counterintelligence, monitored Allied frequencies continuously. Their analysts were skilled and experienced, and yet, in operation after operation, they accepted the Ghost Army's traffic as authentic. This was not because the German analysts were incompetent. It was because the Ghost Army's impersonation had become so sophisticated that it was, within the analytical framework available to 1944 signals, indistinguishable from the genuine article. The cost of illusion. What the Ghost Army endured. It would be a misrepresentation of the Ghost Army's experience to suggest that their war was without danger or loss. The nature of deception operations required the unit to operate in precisely the locations where it was most important to deceive the enemy, which was to say, at or near the front, in sectors where the German threat was real and immediate. A unit of 1,100 men equipped with nothing heavier than half-tracks and light vehicles, operating in forward positions while impersonating formations of 15,000, was in a position of extraordinary vulnerability if the deception was penetrated. The men of the Ghost Army lived with this knowledge constantly. The briefings before each operation were, by all accounts, frank about the risks. If German commanders discovered that the armor facing them was made of rubber, the response would be swift and overwhelming. The Ghost Army, with its light armament and its artistic sensibilities, would have no means of resistance. The Ludendorff Bridge operation of February 1945, in which Ghost Army elements operated in positions only a few hundred yards from active German combat outposts, epitomized this exposure. The men who pumped air into inflatable Shermans while mortar rounds fell within earshot were performing an act of institutional courage that their post-war anonymity has obscured. Corporal Victor Dowd, a painter from Brooklyn who would later exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art, kept a journal throughout his time with the Ghost Army that has survived in fragmentary form. In an entry from the autumn of 1944, he wrote something that captures the specific quality of the Ghost Army's psychological experience with unsettling precision. There is a particular kind of fear that comes from pretending, he wrote. You are afraid, the way any soldier is afraid. But you are also performing, and the performance requires that you do not show the fear. So you become an actor playing a soldier while being a soldier who is afraid. It is a very strange thing to be. Casualties among the Ghost Army were real, if modest by the brutal arithmetic of the Western Front. The unit suffered dead and wounded in several of its operations, a fact that was classified for decades, along with the rest of the Ghost Army's history, and that has only been fully acknowledged in recent scholarship. The men who died in the service of illusion deserve the same recognition as those who died in the service of firepower. They were, in the end, soldiers who had found an unconventional way to fight, but soldiers nonetheless. The psychological strain of maintaining elaborate deceptions over extended periods, of living in a world where the boundaries between the real and the fabricated were deliberately and constantly blurred, left marks on many of the men that did not heal quickly. The artist Arthur Singer, who spent much of 1944 and 1945 meticulously reproducing the insignia of divisions that did not exist, spoke late in his life of recurring dreams in which he could not determine whether the world around him was real or manufactured. The war taught me, he said, that reality is much more fragile than anyone wants to admit. Operation Viersen. The masterpiece. The Ghost Army's final and most consequential operation came in the last days of March 1945, when the Allied advance into Germany itself was entering its decisive phase. The Rhine River, the historic, mythologized barrier of German strategic imagination, the river that Hitler had vowed would stop the Allied advance, was being crossed in multiple locations. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's planners had identified a crossing point near the city of Viersen, in the industrial heartland of the Ruhr, as a site where a successful crossing could be achieved with minimum German resistance, if German attention could be directed elsewhere. The Ghost Army's task was to simulate the presence of the 30th Infantry Division and the 79th Infantry Division preparing to cross the Rhine at a false location, 12 miles north of the actual crossing point. If the deception succeeded, German defensive forces would concentrate at the false site, and the actual crossing at Viersen would proceed against diminished resistance. The operation was given the code name Viersen, after the city it was designed to protect, and it was the most ambitious deception the Ghost Army had ever attempted. The preparation was meticulous. Radio operators had been studying the 30th and 79th Division's communications patterns for weeks. The inflatable equipment was pre-positioned. Sonic equipment was moved into forward positions that were, in some cases, within direct observation range of German positions across the river, a calculated risk that reflected the Ghost Army's growing operational confidence. The personal deception component was intensive. Ghost Army soldiers, in the markings of the two target divisions, moved through rear areas, allowed themselves to be observed, engaged in carefully calibrated indiscreet conversation about the upcoming operation. For 72 hours before the actual crossing, the Ghost Army performed. Radio traffic built steadily, mimicking the communications signature of two divisions moving into assault positions. Sonic equipment broadcast the sounds of troops and vehicles concentrating along the false crossing site. Inflatable assault boats, the Ghost Army had added these to its inventory for exactly this kind of river operation, appeared along the riverbank, dummy artillery positions, equipped with actual artillery pieces that the Ghost Army was permitted to fire, produced the muzzle flashes and sound signatures of real fire preparation. The Germans responded exactly as planned. Intelligence reports from the hours preceding the actual crossing confirmed that the Volksgrenadier divisions defending the sector concentrated their available reserves against the false site. Anti-tank gun positions were repositioned. Artillery fire fell on the false crossing area. The German commander responsible for the sector allocated his limited mobile reserves to the point of greatest apparent danger, which was to say, the point of no danger at all, because the Ghost Army was there. The actual crossing at Viersen began in the early morning hours of March 25, 1945. It encountered far lighter resistance than planners had anticipated or feared. Units that should have been held up for hours or days by German defensive fire crossed with remarkable speed. The bridgehead was secured. The armor poured through. And as dawn broke over the Rhine on the morning of March 26, the war in the West had entered its final act, an act that the Ghost Army's last performance had helped to write. Major General James Van Fleet, commanding the forces that made the actual crossing, later said that the ease of the operation had surprised everyone. He did not know at the time the specific reason for German underperformance at Viersen. The Ghost Army's role remained classified, but when the after-action reports were compiled and the German dispositions in the hours before the crossing were reconstructed, the picture was unambiguous. The Ghost Army's simulation of two divisions had drawn exactly the response it was designed to draw. The mathematics of what did not happen at Viersen, the casualties that were not suffered, the men who came home, belongs to the Ghost Army's account. The ecosystem of deception. Why this could only have happened here. The Ghost Army was not an accident. It was not the product of one man's genius, although there were genuinely brilliant men among its ranks. It was the product of an ecosystem, a specific convergence of American industrial capacity, American cultural peculiarity, and American institutional flexibility that could not have been replicated in any other nation at any other moment in history. Begin with the industrial dimension. The inflatable equipment that formed the Ghost Army's most visible weapon did not emerge from improvisation. It emerged from the American rubber industry, specifically from the B.F. Goodrich Company, which had been producing inflatable products for industrial and commercial applications for decades, and which had the manufacturing infrastructure, the material science knowledge, and the engineering capacity to develop military-grade inflatable decoys to exacting specifications when the Army came asking. The rubber compounds used in the inflatable Shermans were optimized not merely for durability, but for specific visual and radar reflective properties that would make them convincing to enemy observation. This was precision engineering masquerading as theater, and it required a manufacturing base that only the United States, among the major belligerents, possessed in sufficient depth. The sonic equipment tells a parallel story. The Bell Telephone Laboratories, which developed the recording and playback systems used by the 3132 Signal Service Company, represented the leading edge of applied acoustics research in the world. The engineers who produced the Ghost Army's sound library were men who understood the physics of sound propagation, who could calculate how acoustic signatures changed with distance, temperature, and terrain, and who could design playback systems optimized for maximum effective range. This was not amateur electronics. It was the application of institutional scientific knowledge accumulated over decades by one of the world's premier research institutions. The radio deception capacity rested on the American telecommunications industry's extraordinary depth, both in equipment and in personnel. The United States entered the war with more licensed amateur radio operators per capita than any other nation on Earth. These men, and some women, had been tinkering with radio equipment since adolescence. They understood circuits and propagation, and the behavior of radio waves in ways that could not be quickly taught. When the Ghost Army needed radio operators of exceptional skill, the Army could draw on a reservoir of talent that existed nowhere else. The men who impersonated the 30th Division's radio operators had been experimenting with Morse code since they were teenagers in their bedrooms. Their skill was not military training. It was a lifetime hobby that had, by the precise historical accident of the Second World War, become one of the most strategically important technical abilities in the world. And then there was the cultural dimension, which is perhaps the most American of all. The United States, alone among the major powers of the Second World War, had developed by 1942 a mature industrial culture of professional illusion-making. Hollywood, Broadway, Madison Avenue, the commercial art world, that was, in aggregate, arguably the most sophisticated apparatus for the manufacture of convincing artificial realities that any civilization had ever produced. The men who designed the Ghost Army's visual deceptions had been trained in schools and studios whose entire purpose was to make audiences believe in things that were not real. They understood the psychology of perception. They understood what the eye sought and what it dismissed. They understood how to create focal points, how to control visual narrative, how to make a viewer's brain cooperate in its own deception. Two philosophies of war, and why one could not see the other. The German intelligence failure that allowed the Ghost Army to operate with such effectiveness for so long was not simply a technical failure. It was a philosophical failure, a failure that grew from the fundamental assumptions embedded in German military culture about the nature of war and the nature of the enemy. The German military tradition, magnificent in so many respects, was built on a conception of war as a physical contest between material forces. The genius of the Wehrmacht, the operational flexibility, the emphasis on initiative at all levels, the extraordinary tactical proficiency that made it so formidable, operated within a framework that ultimately privileged the tangible over the intangible, the kinetic over the cognitive. German military education produced officers of exceptional operational skill. It produced, in rather smaller numbers, officers who thought systematically about the manipulation of enemy perception. There were exceptions. The Abwehr and the Wehrmacht's signals intelligence apparatus contained men of great analytical sophistication. But the systemic failure to take strategic deception seriously as a military capability, the failure to invest in it, to train for it, to defend against it, left the German intelligence apparatus with a blind spot of extraordinary consequence. When German signals analysts examined Allied radio traffic, they were looking for the indicators of authenticity that they knew real traffic would display. The Ghost Army had studied those indicators and reproduced them. The analysts found what they were looking for, and so they stopped looking. This was the trap that confirmation bias set for the German analytical apparatus. Once a working assumption was established, that the radio traffic belonged to a real division, that the aerial photographs showed real tanks, subsequent evidence was processed through the filter of that assumption. Anomalies were explained away. Inconsistencies were attributed to the fog of war. The possibility that the entire body of evidence had been fabricated simply did not occupy a central place in the German analysts' conceptual framework, because the German military culture had not taught them to think systematically about such a possibility. The American cultural tradition offered, in this respect, a specific and decisive advantage. A nation that had spent a century being entertained by P.T. Barnum, by carnival barkers, by vaudeville performers, by Hollywood studios, by advertising agencies, by radio drama, a nation whose cultural life was saturated with the techniques and philosophy of professional deception, produced, when it went to war, men who thought about the manipulation of belief with an intuitive fluency that was genuinely unique. The Ghost Army's artists and advertising men were not applying alien skills to warfare. They were applying the central skills of their professional lives to a new context. And the German military, which had no equivalent cultural tradition of professional large-scale illusion-making, had no adequate framework for imagining what they were up against. There is an irony here that historical distance makes visible. The Third Reich was, in certain respects, a sophisticated practitioner of psychological manipulation at the mass political level. The Nazi propaganda apparatus, under Joseph Goebbels, was a formidable instrument. But propaganda, directed at civilian populations, designed to build belief and suppress doubt in the service of a political program, is a fundamentally different discipline from tactical military deception, which requires not the amplification of existing beliefs, but the precise insertion of specific false beliefs into the mind of a trained professional who is actively trying to determine what is true. The Germans were good at the former. They were comprehensively outmatched in the latter. And in war, the latter is what matters. The final reckoning, what the numbers confirm. The Ghost Army was officially deactivated on September 12, 1945. Its records were immediately classified and would remain so for more than 50 years. The men who had served in it returned to civilian life carrying a secret they were legally prohibited from sharing, and so they shared it with no one. Bill Blass became a fashion legend. Ellsworth Kelly became one of the most important painters of the 20th century. Arthur Singer became a celebrated wildlife illustrator whose work graced the pages of National Geographic. Victor Dowd continued to paint. They gave interviews, attended exhibitions, received awards, and never, for decades, spoke publicly about the most extraordinary thing any of them had ever done. The numbers, when they were finally declassified and studied by military historians in the 1990s and 2000s, were remarkable in their consistency. 21 operations. 1,100 men, simulated forces of up to 30,000. The German units diverted, held back, mispositioned, or exhausted against phantom targets numbered in the multiple tens of thousands at various points in the campaign. The German artillery ammunition expended against positions held by nothing but inflatable rubber, ammunition that had to be manufactured, transported, stored, and fired at real cost in real German resources, represented a meaningful drain on a Wehrmacht that was already under severe logistical pressure. Most significantly, the casualty calculations. Military historians and operational analysts who have examined the Ghost Army's operations in detail have produced estimates that, while varying in their specific figures, converge on a conclusion that is difficult to argue with. The Ghost Army's deceptions, by drawing German forces away from actual Allied operations, reduced Allied casualties in those operations by numbers ranging from the tens of thousands to figures significantly higher. The crossing of the Rhine alone, Operation Viersen, may have saved between 10 and 30,000 lives in the space of 48 hours. Set against those numbers, the Ghost Army's own casualties, which included dead and wounded, but numbered in the dozens rather than the hundreds, produce a ratio of military effectiveness that has few parallels in the history of the Second World War. Per man deployed, per dollar invested, per round of ammunition expended, the Ghost Army was among the most cost-effective military units the United States ever fielded. The economy of means by which it achieved its results stands in almost comical contrast to the industrial-scale destruction that characterized the rest of the Western Front. The 41 decorations, including 4 Legion of Merit awards and dozens of Bronze Stars, that were eventually distributed among the Ghost Army's personnel, represent a recognition that came decades too late for many of the men who earned them. The Congressional Gold Medal awarded to the Ghost Army collectively in 2022, nearly 80 years after the events it recognized, was accepted largely by the sons and daughters and grandchildren of men who never lived to see their work acknowledged. The final curtain. What the Ghost Army teaches us. There is a lesson in the Ghost Army's story that extends far beyond the particular history of the Second World War, far beyond the specific operational details of inflatable Shermans and recorded tank sounds and impersonated radio operators. It is a lesson about the nature of reality in warfare, and, by extension, in all human conflict. Reality, the Ghost Army demonstrated, is not a fixed and objective thing that exists independently of the minds that perceive it. It is at least in part a construction, a model that the perceiving mind builds from the evidence available to it, using the assumptions it has been trained to apply. That model can be manipulated. It can be furnished with false evidence, designed to exploit the expected assumptions, delivered through the channels the perceiver trusts, and allowed to complete itself. The enemy's own intelligence apparatus can be recruited, in effect, as a co-conspirator in its own deception, because the German signals analysts who accepted the Ghost Army's radio traffic as authentic were doing their jobs diligently. They were applying the correct analytical framework. They were reaching the wrong conclusion because the evidence they were analyzing had been specifically engineered to produce that conclusion. The Ghost Army's legacy is not merely operational, it is doctrinal. The principles its men developed, multidimensional deception operating across visual, electronic, acoustic, and human intelligence channels simultaneously, the requirement for internal logical consistency across time, the imperative to understand the enemy's analytical framework and to feed it exactly what it expects to find, became foundational to American and Allied military deception doctrine in the decades that followed. The descendants of the Ghost Army's methods can be traced through the sophisticated electronic warfare and information operations programs of modern militaries, through the principles of operational security and strategic deception that shape military planning to this day. The men of the Ghost Army were, by any reasonable measure, anomalies, artists and advertising men and radio amateurs who had been assigned, by the improbable alchemy of wartime necessity, to a mission that required exactly the skills their unconventional professional lives had given them. They were, in the most literal sense, the right people in the right place at the right time. History occasionally produces such alignments, and when it does, the results can be extraordinary. But there was nothing magical about what they accomplished. It was engineering, it was planning, it was discipline and professionalism, and the willingness to rehearse, to refine, to learn from failure and improve. The rubber tanks that fooled Hitler's generals were not miracles. They were the product of careful design, careful manufacture, careful deployment, and careful integration into a broader system of deception that was, taken as a whole, more sophisticated than anything the German military could counter. In the autumn of 1944, somewhere in northeastern France, a German artillery battery received orders to fire on a target that its intelligence officers had identified as an American tank concentration. The battery fired. The shells fell with mechanical accuracy on the coordinates provided, and in the smoking field that the shells left behind, there was nothing. No burning steel, no exploding ammunition, no dying men, only rubber and canvas, and the slowly deflating remnants of what had been, for the purposes of German military planning, an entire armored division. The artillerists did not know what they had shot at. Their commanders did not know. The intelligence officers who had identified the target did not know. Somewhere nearby, in a farmhouse that served as a command post, men with calloused hands and paint-stained fingers and an intimate familiarity with the acoustic properties of tank engines listened to the impacts and quietly noted the results. Then they packed up their equipment and moved on to the next performance. They were never famous. For 50 years they were not even known. But the world they helped to build, the world in which the war ended, when and how and where it did, the world in which the men who crossed the Rhine at Viersen came home rather than dying on a riverbank in Germany, that world is the monument they left behind. It stands without their names on it. It stands without a plaque. It stands in the simple, irreducible fact that they did what they set out to do, and that the enemy never saw it coming. In the end, the Ghost Army's greatest deception was not the inflatable tanks, or the recorded engine sounds, or the counterfeit radio traffic. Their greatest deception was this: they made the Germans look in all the wrong places for all the wrong things, while the real danger assembled, in plain sight, exactly where the Germans were not looking. That is the oldest lesson of war, and 1,100 painters and radio operators and advertising men reminded the world of it. One ghost at a time.